All right, everyone. So I'm going to get started. It's 9:30. Welcome to the Source of Income Protections legislative update and discussion. So excited for all of the presenters, all of the guest panelists that we have with us this morning, including folks from Housing Justice Center, HOME LIne, Minnesota Housing, Representative Her, and Linda Soderstrom, who participates in a number of coalitions and has some experience that she's going to be sharing with us this morning. So I just want to welcome all of you, and I encourage everyone to use the chat to respond. We will be collecting all of the chat. So if you have comments, questions, please use the chat, share why you're here this morning, what you're working on that's related to source of income protections, and any questions that you have. We use that chat just both for facilitating questions with our speakers, but also just to collect some information from all of you if that's what you provide in the chat. So I encourage you to do that. And I'm going to turn it over to Shana Jimenez from Housing Justice Center to kind of kick us off and provide us with just a brief context in what we're talking about here this morning in terms of source of income protections. Hey, Shana.
Good morning, everyone. So my name's Shana. I am an attorney at the Housing Justice Center, and I'm really excited to talk today about source of income protection and really what are the needs that we're seeing in the community and why this legislation is so important. So currently in Minnesota, as many of you know, families wait, sometimes months, often years to get a voucher. And when they get this voucher that they could use anywhere that they want, whether it's a local voucher or a larger Section 8 voucher that they can choose the community where they want to live, they run into these barriers. Currently in Minnesota, landlords can refuse to rent to someone based on their source of income. I just decided to pull yesterday off of Craigslist. I just did a quick search of Section 8. And on the first 2 pages, I ran into 14 hits where it said things like, sorry, no Section 8, please don't call for Section 8, we don't take rent vouchers, not approved, we don't participate. All of those words, just no, 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 no. And really that means that these people who have filled out so much paperwork and jumped through so many government hoops to get into this program because they deeply need that affordable housing to have stability in their life, it's a false promise. They don't have that, or they're limited in their choices. And while the Minnesota Human Rights Act, when it was introduced, really tried to address this issue, there's been court interpretations that have weakened that. The legal framework doesn't protect renters from this problem, and people face issues like no Section 8 because landlords can say that it's too much of an administrative hurdle for them as a business owner to participate in a voucher program. And we're really looking to be in line with other jurisdictions that are also seeing these problems in their communities. Source of income protection laws are used in 19 other states and 106 local jurisdictions as of October 2021. So we're really looking to get in line with those jurisdictions and also to really provide that protection that Minnesota families need.
Thanks, Shana. Shana, one thing I'd be hopeful that you could touch a little bit more on, and I'll go over with Representative Her what happened in the 2021 session, but can you talk a little bit about why a legislative strategy, why amending state statute through legislative action versus going through the courts, why we're taking that approach and some of the pros and cons to both?
Oh, absolutely. So another strategy could be to say, hey, we have this legal framework in the Minnesota Human Rights Act that says that landlords are not supposed to discriminate based on receipt of public assistance. And we could challenge there's a Court of Appeals decision that says it's not really, discriminating based on source of income if someone chooses for a business reason not to participate in a voucher program or to discriminate based on source of income. We could try to challenge that. The pros of that would be that we wouldn't have to amend any laws, and that it could kind of bypass the political process and do what the Minnesota Human Rights Act intended in the first place. The cons of that is we've already had a bad case, and it's precedential, and that's really hard to overcome. In housing cases, there isn't always a clear shot, and it's less, it's more of a risk. It's something that's worth pursuing if the right case came, but really what advocates have been pushing for and what we think is the stronger approach is this legislative strategy for a couple of reasons. One being that once it's in law, it's there, and that protection really will send that message out there and renew this for to recommit to this proposition. It's clean, it's easy, everyone's on the same page. You don't have to wait for lengthy court hearings at the district court, the Court of Appeals, possibly even the Supreme Court, and would be a faster route to help more families that are in need right now.
Thanks. That was, I think, really helpful, Shana. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Glidden, who's going to moderate the next portion of our panel this morning. Elizabeth?
Thank you very much, Libby, and hello, everyone. I think Libby has been reminding you to utilize the chat. And as we go into the panel, if there's feedback you have on what you hear from the panelists or question for the panelists, please put those questions and comments in the chat. So I'm really pleased to be able to have some conversation with three great folks. We have Linda Soderstrom, who is a housing advocate who really shares her influence and expertise with many different coalitions and campaigns. And she is also someone that I often hear introduce herself as a Section 8 voucher holder. We also have Lael Robertson, policy attorney with Minnesota Housing, and Rep Kaohly from HOME LIne. And I'm going to dive right in. We can probably take down the slides and focus on the speakers and start with a question for Linda, because we kind of have heard this kind of theoretical explanation in a sense of what are we trying to do with pursuing greater source of income protections for housing and the voucher program, but it'd be helpful for you to perhaps break it down for us. What does the search for housing look like if you are utilizing a voucher under our current system?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for having me today. I've had the Section 8 voucher for several years, and when I was given notice at Crossroads at Penn, and also a couple of years later, displaced again, it takes days and days and dozens of searches. I literally made contact with, through the telephone or internet, 20 or so apartment complexes a day for about 20 days in 2015, and never found a single yes to accept the Section 8 voucher.
And, you know, I think something too to layer onto this is what is the experience of someone when you are in the position of having to look for housing, just generally in this situation where maybe you have to move for some situation, been forced to move, whatever is that situation. And what then is that emotional and physical experience?
Again, thank you for that question. My monthly budget is around $750 to $800. So my rent needs to be about $250 or a little over. And that's what the voucher enables, because HUD pays on the first of the month the remainder. If my rent were $750, then HUD would pay the other $500. And so I think of it as being a very good landlord's program. I live places for years at a time. I always call in if a repair is needed. I've owned my own home previously, so I would never let a repair sit around undone. And if some untoward activities are going on around the property, I call that in as well. I'm a good monitor on the place. And I think, Elizabeth, that it eventually will wear you down in searching if you cannot find a place to live, when in fact, I mean, this is the time when you're supposed to be out there with your application and full of energy and showing what a great tenant and a representative of the program you would be. But if you're being rejected and dejected day after day, then it's just, you're at conflict. How am I going to present well when I actually am really being worn down?
I'm going to turn to Lael for a next question, because we heard from Shana that often there are questions raised by property owners or landlords about the program, and some may say participation in the Section 8 program is burdensome or challenging. And I'm curious, Lael, if you have some, what would you say to someone who is raising that as a question or a concern? Because that is something commonly heard.
Yeah, we hear that commonly. I think that the truth is there are some requirements to be part of the program, but most of the PHAs around the state, and I'll highlight Minneapolis public housing for a moment, most of the PHAs are trying to make it as workable with the landlords as possible. They are trying to cut down barriers. They are trying to make the process more streamlined. Minnesota Public Housing, when Minneapolis was going through their Section 8 ordinance revamp, they actually conducted a couple of studies to see how they could make their program more efficient and effective. And I think you're seeing that around the state with the PHAs, the public housing agencies and housing redevelopment agencies, really wanting to make it as doable for landlords as they can possibly do. The reality is it is working with a government program, so there are going to be some things that are required. A lot of it is things that are already required as part of being a landlord and being a housing provider. So like in Minneapolis, you'll see that there will be some housing quality standards that must be met, but those housing quality standards are in line with the licensing standards that are required for Minneapolis. So the argument is more of a let's educate landlords about what the requirements are, because they aren't as onerous as some may assume them to be. And they are, again, oftentimes in line with what is already required as a business owner, in order to get licensed in the different municipalities that you have your properties in.
I'm going to turn to Eric here with this next one, because I know that state of Minnesota has a terrible history of perpetuating disparities, race-based disparities, and race equity has been identified by the governor and many within the legislature as a priority issue. And I would like to know, Eric, if you can talk to us a little bit about how or why working on source of income protections is a race equity issue.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and the rest of the panelists. Appreciate the opportunity today. I'll just note, the people of color, there's a lot of data out there. I'm sure MHP has some of this information on their website, and I probably don't have to speak to the folks on this call. Many who already know that there's disproportionate impacts around housing on people of color. Renters people of color are disproportionately renters. Our organization runs a free and legal hotline for renters, and we, particularly in the metro area, the majority of our clients are people of color. When we were working on the Minneapolis ordinance, we actually specifically looked at some of the data. So public housing authorities like MPHA and others throughout the state do collect demographic and other characteristics about the folks that they serve. And I don't have the most recent data for Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, but back when we were advocating for this, for the the city ordinance, you know, we were able to pull up that data and find that I think it was close to 80% of voucher participants in Minneapolis, in the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority program at that time, were Black, African American, or Native American. Also, I think around 20% of the voucher holders at that time had a disability. And then also around half of the voucher holders at that time were female-headed households with children. So there are very disproportionate impacts on people of color and folks that might be in vulnerable situations. And so that's why this is really you know, an equity issue in that regard. And it's not just, you know, a Minneapolis problem. Our organization for years did a study around the ability of voucher holders to secure housing, and we did another follow-up to those studies. We looked at the metro area, and we've also done a focus in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and found that, you know, folks with a voucher, the study we did in 2016 or 2017 for the city of Minneapolis showed that less than a quarter of the units that we surveyed off of a search on Craigslist, Housing Link, and a variety of other apartment searches. So just like Linda was talking about, so you have folks that are lucky enough to get that golden ticket, that voucher. It's tough enough as is to get the voucher in the first place. There's waiting lists throughout the state. Once you get that, then you have these other barriers, and these are folks that have already been experiencing you know, problems and disparities in their housing. And so yeah, in Minneapolis it was less than a quarter, and historically when we did our report for other areas of the state, it was pretty consistently around less than a third of the units that we surveyed were actually available to voucher holders. Just like Linda mentioned, and just like Shana mentioned up front, you look on Craigslist and just a lot of listings that just blatantly say no Section 8.
Thanks, Eric. And you know, that kind of brings me maybe back to Linda, because I'm not sure when you first started talking, Linda, I know that you've lived in all sorts of different places around the state, and sometimes this does get pegged as, is this a certain geography where this issue happens or not? And maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of where you live now, and kind of a little bit of the economics of which you already kind of touched on a little bit, but maybe a little bit more with kind of the budgetary truths of trying to utilize that voucher, and kind of where you're at now, and what would be those opportunities without the voucher.
Well, and I, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I would piggyback a little bit on what Lael said, to work with our housing authorities and our housing and redevelopment authorities, because they do communicate with landlords. I live in rural Minnesota now, and actually the voucher is more desirable here. It is a desirable way of housing people. And not across the board, people are very skeptical, but when you are a person who stays somewhere stably for a long time, treats the property as you would, as if you owned it yourself, and then you hear people in meetings, and I go to meetings down now, even though I'm out of the Twin Cities, I still go to housing advocacy meetings. I hear people say, well, I had a friend and he got his, you know, those tenants trashed the place. Like, no. That's just not simply true. It's simply not who I am. I don't represent people who hurt properties. And I think that kind of repetitious, you know, downgrade to the humans who want a place to live. Otherwise, I would have nowhere to stay.
Thank you, Linda. I was going to go back to maybe Eric for a second here. Libby put a question in the chat that was kind of similar to a question I had already maybe flagged to ask. So we have had over the last year plus greater funds, primarily through the federal funds that have been dedicated to something similar but a little different, emergency rental assistance. And Libby's question was actually whether there might be any lessons learned or takeaways about what's working and not working that might be translated to how we think about voucher utilization and related to what we're trying to do with the source of income protections.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Elizabeth and Libby. I think that there's a couple takeaways. One is that, there were some provisions in the phase out law, the end of the eviction moratorium. The one remaining protection that is sticking with us until June of this year, and that's that you cannot be evicted, or at least you can defend against an eviction for non-payment of rent if you have a pending application. And so there's that is critical. People were able to use rental assistance through Rent Help MN. Much of them have been utilized, as you mentioned. That's because, we are still in the midst of an emergency. We were in a housing emergency before the pandemic. The pandemic isn't over, and people are still, to a certain extent, out of work, and there's other benefits that are ending this year. And so there is still a need for rental assistance and for some protections around it. One thing that we are very concerned about is that we are hearing from clients who are still seeing instances where Rent Help MN is able to help them get caught up on rent, but their landlord is either choosing to end their lease after that once they get paid up, or they're even, in some cases, landlords are refusing to take Rent Help MN. Now, luckily, there is some provisions that I think were in the U.S. Treasury guidance that Minnesota Housing and the Rent Help MN program took on, which was if your landlord refuses it, you as the tenant can receive the funding. That has helped some tenants. It's not as fast as it could be, but it is a benefit there, and so the tenant can utilize those funds somewhere else. But that just goes to show that is a key protection that needs to be there. The program is prepared to pay those past due rents for tenants, and there are some landlords out there refusing to take it. And so that just goes to show that both in the case of emergency rental assistance, which is needed now, it's been needed for a while, and we're going to continue to see a need for that going forward to prevent displacement and eviction. The other solutions out there for the instability that many of our neighbors are facing is something like universal vouchers, just a large amount of funding to go towards a voucher program. And if that is a solution, which it is a very good idea and should be funded, and we should go forward with that, but we need this additional protection to ensure that folks that are lucky enough to get that golden ticket, that voucher that is worth so much and is coveted by many people, because there is such a limited number of them now. Once you get that, you need to be able to find a place with it, and that's what we've already heard Linda and others speak to, and what we've seen from our clients is that not only is it difficult to find a place, but then there's also segregation that happens. So, some of our reports demonstrated that there are certain areas of the community that just refuse it overall, refuse vouchers, and so to a certain extent, sometimes folks are limited in their choices and may end up choosing a housing opportunity that is not in their best interest, whether it's not in good condition, or it's not in a community that's close to a school or a work opportunity or something like that.
I see one of my panelists has her hand up, so I hope I didn't miss calling on you when you wanted to comment before, but Lael.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to talk about what one thing that Eric said. So, it's hard for me to not comment when I have something to say.
Yeah, no, please do.
But it is a little like comparing apples and oranges, talking about the rent help to Section 8, because with rent help, people are already in the property, right? I think what we can learn from that is how much there is a need for rental assistance, as Eric is talking about that people are in unaffordable apartments, they are cost burdened, and the reality is that vouchers help with that, right? Vouchers allow them to have affordable rent and hopefully in safe and suitable housing as well. And I just want to say from a state perspective, one of the reasons to support this, one of the reasons that the governor supports this is because not only for all of the really human reasons that Linda and Shayna have already mentioned, but from an economic and a fiscal perspective, the state is at this point, we have the rent help MN assistance, but that's going to go away. And the state only has a small amount of money that they are able to distribute for housing assistance through things like our Bridges program and our Housing Trust Fund program, but that's a very small amount of assistance that we have. And the voucher program really is the largest program that supports the most people be in affordable rent for the lowest income and the lowest wealth people. I think it was back in 2019 that there were over 31,000 households that were being served by the Housing Choice Voucher. And so if that money isn't allowed to go into Minnesota, we're missing an opportunity to use these federal dollars to support Minnesota citizens and families to have safe and stable housing. So I just needed to put that out there. I'll lower my hand now, Elizabeth.
Okay. But if I am not noticing other panelists who want to comment on a question, I apologize, and just give me the high sign like that. That was actually perfect. So, and I'm also going to look to Libby. I think we have at least about 5 more minutes for some Q&A, and just alert me when we need to end, because I've got probably more questions than we have time for once Representative Her joins our call. There's an interesting question actually posed by Libby about property condition. And I was actually curious, Linda, if you had any thoughts on that from either your own experience, or I know that you have worked with a lot of residents across the state. I was just curious from kind of more of a personal perspective, and then maybe we would see if Lael or Eric know if there's any data on that. Whether Section 8 properties might be better cared for or less cared for than some others.
Honestly, again, Lael said it first, it's the same. It's the same standard. So there's about 10 things on a checklist. They come out like now during COVID every other year or by telephone only. So this arduous or burdensome reputation that's out there is not even true anymore. If the home is the apartment home is in good enough shape to pass inspection, it can stay in that status for up to 24 months, and that's a change. I have found that all the homes that I lived in with Section 8 were well kept and side by side with other people at fair market, so no problem.
There's a couple other questions I want to make sure I get in, so I might start with Eric on this one. One is that I think sometimes this is just again some level setting with folks on this call about what will happen with this proposed legislation and what will not. In terms of a question often asked by both renters and property owners or landlords is about whether a landlord would be required under this to accept any applicant who comes with a Section 8 voucher. And so, Eric, I'm wondering if you can just kind of level set with us, just so that we're honest about what would happen with this and what would not. What are
Sure.
still the landlord's abilities to say yes or no?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one of the most common ones we get. And, my understanding is that the state legislation, the proposal is similar to what Minneapolis passed and what is the law in so many other states and cities throughout the country. Again, this is another place where Minnesota is unfortunately behind in tenant landlord law as compared to a lot of other states. It does not mandate participation. What it does is it gets a tenant's foot in the door. Landlords are only obligated to consider renting to a household with a rental subsidy. That means they can't just blatantly refuse to rent or impose different terms or conditions or use some sort of other advertisement or other communications or otherwise treat households that are hoping to pay a portion of their rent with a subsidy they can't be treated differently from tenants without rental subsidies. But this is a big deal. I mean, again, what Shana did and mentioned at the beginning of today's session, you can do it yourself. Go on Craigslist, anywhere really, and search apartments. You will just find listing after listing that says no Section 8. And I'll be honest with you, when we were doing our studies, both in the metro area and then in 2016, 2017, when we did Minneapolis and St. Paul specific, we had volunteers come in and help make these calls as prospective renters. And sometimes, you see the listings that just say no Section 8. We had our volunteers sometimes call and the responses, really, really harmful negative responses by some landlords in some cases. And so what this does is it stops that kind of practice from happening. It opens up, again, like what I mentioned, our studies, for 15 years, we did studies in Hennepin, Dakota, and Anoka County around the landlord's willingness to accept vouchers, and pretty consistently it was a third or less than a third of the listings that we surveyed were available to voucher holders. And then when we did our Minneapolis survey in 2016, it was less than a quarter. And so this would open that up, right? That there would be so many more opportunities for tenants to secure housing. Other types of tenant screening are still allowed. There are rules in Minneapolis around tenant screening practices, but if there are other aspects of tenant screening that a landlord does consistently, that's not going to necessarily be impacted by this.
Thank you, Eric. I have a very last question that I'm going to pose to Lael, or maybe it's more asking for some additional comment. And I know Representative Her has just joined us, and kind of to this point, I'll also recognize that Rachel Robinson from Minnesota Housing is also on this call, and thank you, Rachel, for being here. But Lael, I think you kind of sideways mentioned that the governor has supported this, and we didn't really introduce that at the beginning of the call. So I wonder if you could say anything about where is the governor at in determining his priorities for the 2022 session? Is it possible this will be on that list? And why do you think the governor has supported this? Because it was on the priority list in the 2021 session.
Sure. Thank you for the question. It was on the priority list for the governor last year, and it's my understanding that we are carrying that forward, that will be on the priority list for the governor this year. Again, it is really based on the governor's position of safe, suitable housing for all Minnesotans. It is based on his racial equity platform. And also, as Eric mentioned, I think it is really important to mention that the governor has been very focused on safe and suitable housing and education for families as well. And I think as of 2017, I know that's a long time ago. It seems like so many years ago, but let's just say that thousands and thousands and thousands of kids, 42,000 kids as of 2017 were impacted by voucher. They were living in voucher households. So we have the racial equity, we have the family, the need for support for Minnesota families. And again, the economic perspective, which really is we want to use and leverage the federal dollars that are coming into the state in order to provide housing for Minnesotans. And if we aren't using those voucher dollars, it's just a loss. It's a loss for everybody in Minnesota. So it is a priority. It will be in the policy bill for the governor, and we're excited to stand behind it.
Well, thank you. And I want to say special thank you to Linda, Eric, and Lael. Thank you. We appreciate you and that you shared your expertise and perspective with us. And with that, I'm turning over to Libby, not Linda, Libby.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Brian, can you get this slide up? I'll just give a very brief recap of what happened in 2021 before turning it over to questions with Representative Her, our chief author. So as Lael mentioned, this was a part of Governor Walz's housing policy priorities in 2021. And so it was introduced at the Minnesota legislature last year. Representative Her is the chief author on that bill, and there's a number of co-authors as well. It did not get introduced in the Senate. There was no Republican willing to author the bill, and it sat on a desk instead of being passed to a DFL member in the Senate. And so that's where we stand this year. And really what the bill does is it prohibits discrimination in housing against an individual who's receiving public assistance. So it's Shana talked about that in the beginning. It's really clarifying and going back to the original intent of the legislation. We had hearings last session, and it was included in the House Judiciary Conference Committee report. And so we're optimistic that we'll make it into the conference committee report again this year, but there's work to be done to ensure that it makes its way into law this session, and that there's more momentum, likely continuing in the House side. And we'll get into some of those details with our chief author, Representative Her. So Representative Her, welcome. We're really excited to have you this morning and to talk with you about this just really important piece of legislation that you're carrying. And one thing I should mention is the legislation, House File 835, also includes eviction expungement and pre-eviction notice filing. It's kind of carrying the whole package of tenant protections that the Governor Walz put in his policy agenda last year. So Representative Her, I'm gonna just get right into some questions with you. If you could let folks on this call understand why was it that you said yes to carrying this important piece of legislation? What motivated you to take this up? It's not an easy bill.
It's not an easy bill, but boy, to me, I mean, when this bill came forward and I looked at this, I thought, this is common sense. That there were many, many reasons when I think about my own history and my experience, and what that meant for people from my own community who were trying to find a stable housing, and who oftentimes was relying on public assistance in many aspects of their lives in order for them to create that stability. I think about that this is a safety net that helps people. It made sense to me that that this is something that is very easily fixed for us, right? But when I also think about the current time in which we are in which every day I'm hearing from landlords that they are not able to, that their tenants are not paying rent because of the unusual circumstances that many of us find ourselves in during this difficult time. I just thought, well, this is a guaranteed source of income for them. And that if they want to avoid this situation, we absolutely then should be ensuring that people who will have a guaranteed income coming in to pay for their rent, that those individuals, you would want to prioritize them. And so I just thought for many, many reasons, it just made sense that this is something we absolutely should pass and should be in practice. And it had been in many, many other states along with other municipalities. And so I don't know, it seemed like a no-brainer to me, but apparently this seems to be a very hard concept for people who are not supporting it when it is actually quite simple.
Can you expand on that? Like, what is the opposition that you're hearing? If you're hearing opposition or questions, concerns from members within your own caucus, and then what was some of the opposition that you heard and from your Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle?
Truthfully, Libby, and you're correct when you mentioned that this provision is included in with a couple of other different tenant protection pieces of it. And to be honest, I actually heard the least feedback about this piece. And I think that the reason why is that people understand that this is necessary and this is important. I think what my colleagues across the aisle who are against this is that what they're unwilling to say is that they are invested in protecting landlords and their rights to discriminate however they may want to, so that they get the type of tenants that they want, or what they perceive to be the types of tenants that they believe are better tenants, whatever that bias that creates that for them. And nobody wants to say that out loud. Nobody wants to be truthful about the only reason why we don't accept this is really to discriminate those from low income communities. And that's generally disproportionate Black and Brown and Indigenous folks. And so, I am disheartened because when we can't have honest conversations as to why there isn't support for something that is so common sense, it makes it really hard for us to move the issue forward. And I I think that maybe part of what we need to do is appeal to people to understand the benefits of this, because people have formed their own perception as to who they think, get certain types of vouchers and what types of tenants they may be. And so I think the more proactive we are in ensuring that people understand that is not the case, the more likely we'll be able to get this through, because there is no concrete reasons for opposing this. And I have not actually, from one of my colleagues, heard them give me specific reasons as to why they don't. They just say like, well, we just think that a landlord should have the right to choose, with no other evidence to back up why that should be the case.
So I've seen you in hearings before, and you can get fairly direct with your colleagues and calling them out. I mean, can you just talk about those dynamics that you're in both the housing committee, you're on the taxes committee, judiciary, like how are you as a lawmaker addressing the racial equity component and really the racism that you're hearing, veiled racism? And
oh gosh, Libby, and yes, I do call it out, and I think that the reason that's a tough question to answer, because here's the thing is that though I call out these systems of oppression and the structural and systemic racism, I'm also really keenly aware that people are socialized based on the environment that they've been in. And sometimes my colleagues have had a very small worldview, and that they were socialized to believe in certain things. And I think that part of it is that ensuring that people don't perpetuate the myths and stereotypes, and that they do not perpetuate inaccuracies out into community, because lawmakers are, at the same time that we actually are here to lift up the voices of those we represent, our voices can be quite powerful, and the things that we say and the misinformation that we spread can have huge and widespread harm onto entire communities. And so I do my best in ensuring that when we are in committee and there is misinformation being perpetuated, that I also actually have conversations offline with my colleagues who may not necessarily understand the life experiences of people who do not look like them. And so I do spend quite a bit of time chatting with, the New Republican Caucus about some of the differences in our beliefs. And I do have conversations with my GOP colleagues around that. And truthfully, even within my own DFL caucus, that there's quite a bit of educating, because depending on which area you represent, there's also a different level of comfort in understanding how systemic and structural racism, and then how each one of us help uphold those systems. And so, yes, Libby, you are correct. There's quite a bit out there, and there's much that we need to do, and that we need to call it out when we see it in committee, but we also need to make the effort behind the scenes to really help people understand, so that we can all be on the same page.
So I'm going to ask another question about some of the committee dynamics, because this is a bill that required a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. It was included in that conference committee report. It got complicated because there was a funding element for the Department of Human Rights. And so it has to be funded through the Housing Committee. And I'm just curious, because Senator Draheim was on a call or webinar about a month ago, in which he talked about some of the opposition he's hearing to one of his policy items that he's passionate about, which is zoning, is that it's to keep those people out. And he just doesn't agree with that. So it feels like maybe there should be common ground. He's seen this at least on the issue of home ownership and access and opportunity. I mean, I was under the impression that going through that committee was actually one of the barriers to success, because there wasn't an agreement on funding. Can you talk about that complexity of going through two different committees, and then also the dynamics of the different chairs involved in both the House and Senate Judiciary and Housing committees, and how that's going to impact success for us?
Yes, and you're right, Libby. And I did forget to mention that was actually one of the more concrete pieces. And I'll have to say, truthfully, anytime legislation has any kind of fiscal note attached to it, we're just going to have greater opposition, especially from my colleagues across the aisle. And the fact that they have been trying for many years to reduce the funding of the Department of Human Rights, because they also don't see the necessity of the work that gets done through that office. And so it's a constant battle to keep that office funded. And so anything that increases, particularly that budget, but also that has a fiscal note attached to it, then there is opposition to that. And I'm not sure whether whatever committee it comes out of, if the Senate stays a Republican majority, we're going to continue to have the same pushback regardless of which committee it goes through if there is a fiscal note attached to it. And I'll have to be really honest, like I know that is, it sounds like a very legit talking point that we don't want to increase government reach and we don't want to increase budgets and things like that. But the truth is that when they want something passed that is important to them, that never is an issue. And so to me, these are very legitimate concerns, and yes, it creates barriers for us wanting to move this forward. I would say that the heart of why we can't get something like this passed is truly because of people's own biases and their misplaced stereotypes of people. And then they use the system as the way to give them the excuse to say why they can't fund something. And as I recall, I do not recall the fiscal note on this being super huge. And so I think that, it is just an excuse. And going through any committee, we've had challenges in all committees in the Senate because it is GOP majority that it's been difficult to move any bills over there.
So if this is to be successful, pass into law this year, and you and I have had these conversations, what does it take? Are we going to be able to convince the opposition, or do we advocate our allies and put more pressure on them to ensure that this is included in a final omnibus bill? I mean, can you talk about the pros and cons of those different strategies?
So I would say that I'm an eternal optimist, and that even things like, I'll give you all an example. I actually had a bill, prorated rent, that was introduced in the last biennium. I had no idea that the Republicans would be open to it this past year, and it got included and it was passed without even my knowing that they were considering this. And so, even something that 2 years ago that didn't receive a hearing in the Senate at all was pulled in and was part of the conference committee and was passed into law. That, and in addition to my bill on housing support, which was to increase the amount of time that somebody might be out of a unit before they lose the unit, because they might be in for addiction treatment, which takes longer than the 8 weeks we allowed, and also increasing the dollar amounts to support those programs. That happened at the 11th hour when nobody wanted to hear that bill and nobody wanted to support it. And so because I have seen these things played out, I'm really hopeful that something as simple as this is that we'll still get it passed. I would say that strategically what we need to do is really, find individuals who live in the districts of our GOP senators and representatives and have them reach out, because the truth is that we can get a huge movement of people fighting for this, but if it's not people within certain representative or senators districts, they're really going to say, well, I'm not hearing this from my community, and they won't support it. And so the more we can figure out how we can find people who are willing to stand up and fight for this issue in those districts, I think that the more compelling our case is going to be. And then I would say that we just have to continue to fight, and we have to continue to refine our message so that it targets what might be interesting to them. So my feeling is that this year I'm going to take a broader approach in talking just about how is this really landlord protection, protecting their revenue stream, protecting their ability to not have to, get units ready for a next person and the efforts that go into that, and so reducing their costs. I'm going to, try to figure out a different angle how I'm going to be talking about this to really appeal to those who are opposing it. And then I would say the last thing is that since this bill is wrapped up into the governor's bill, which has other provisions in it, the other provisions are a little bit to my colleagues across the aisle, they are a little bit more contentious. And I would say maybe just the thought of being willing to say, well, how do we know when the discussion is done and say, can we just pull this one piece out and include this language versus the entire bill? And I don't know if that's a strategy we work on with the governor, or does he leave that up to all of us who are in the conference committees to say, okay, can we fight for just this one piece then out of this bill? And so that's something that we should think about too. I'm not suggesting it for that last piece if that's what we do, but I think we should think about it and then also have conversations with all of our partners to say, is that a prudent strategy for us so that we can at least get this piece passed?
Well, I was going to ask you a question, and then also I want to remind folks to pose some questions in the chat, and they can be questions for Representative Her, for Lael, Eric, or Linda. But because this isn't a bill with two other policy items, how do we keep from pitting those issues against one another? I understand in the last minute choices have to be made, difficult decisions have to be made. Not everything is palatable. We should be marching forward this session, trying to pass all three of those provisions. And some of those provisions actually seem like they're going to be taken up in Housing Committee, and Representative Hassan has standalones for both of those two provisions. And we know that Representative Hausman is prioritizing the pre-eviction filing and will likely try and keep that in her committee. So can you talk about some of those as ways that we don't have to pit these issues against one another?
Yeah.
Because in some ways there's different committees and audiences.
There are, and just, I guess, to be very hopeful, and I think I should be able to share this here, but, I had a conversation with Chair Becker-Finn in Judiciary, because some of the bills some of these bills came in front of Judiciary first, and some came in front of Housing first. And so we're working on an approach where we're going to hear all of the tenant protection bills at the same time, which includes this one. So we're going to hear House File, 398, 399, 400, which are HOME-LIne bills. And then we're also going to hear this House File 835, which includes, Representative Hassan's bills along with the source of income. And we're going to try to have one hearing just on housing and tenant protection. And so that's tentatively slated for the third week of session, one of the Judiciary days. And so, Libby, you're hearing from me now that, we should probably start preparing for this. But because this remains a top issue for Democrats in the House. And we know that the pandemic has exacerbated the situations we were already experiencing, and disparities in housing stability and home ownership, and all of the issues in why we think housing is very important and is at the center of all the issues that we experience when it comes to the achievement gap and the wealth and income gap, and and health disparities, that if somebody has a home and they have stable home, they can actually do better in all these other disparities that we are seeing. And so this remains a top priority for us. And so I would say that as this is moving through the House, I have less concern over how do we strategically move these pieces forward. I don't think that on the House I will have to compromise any piece of 835 or the other tenant protection bills that are moving along with them. But I would say that on the Senate side, we do have to think a little bit about how do we look at how we have a conversation around having people look at the bills in very separate parts. Like when I presented the bill on the House side, I really clearly talked about the sections in which belong to each piece of, for each provision that we were talking about. And I think ensuring that people see that this is not one bill that is just trying to do everything, but there's actually different provisions in the bill, and that we could actually pick and choose if there are certain pieces that are not favorable. I think that we just need to make sure that message stays clear for people, that we can move different pieces in at different times should that become the case at the end of this whole process. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question, Libby?
It does. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. So I'm going to actually see if any of the other panelists have any thoughts on what Representative Her has said, because HOME-LIne is championing two of those provisions, and Eric has been involved in all three of the provisions, as is Michael Dahl, who's on as well. And just love to hear alternative perspectives, or kind of what your thoughts and your challenges have been too with the grouping of these together, and how that's benefiting each of the provisions, and also sort of feels like pitting them against each other, but hopefully not yet, and hopefully never. But I don't know, any responses?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate everything Representative Her has said. Spot on. The one thing that I think I already mentioned about the source of income protection is, and that's been shared already, is that this is the law in a lot of other states and cities, and it works fine. There's actually a HUD study that has shown that lease up rates for tenants are increased in jurisdictions that have these types of protections versus those that don't. One of the other provisions that we're advocating for that is in House File 835 is a pre-eviction notice, 14-day pre-eviction notice. Minnesota is one of only just like 2 or 3 or 4 states that do not have a required notice from the landlord to the tenant before a formal eviction can be filed for non-payment of rent. We are absolutely behind almost every other state. And so these are really, I don't understand it. They seem very much common sense solutions that work in other states and other cities. To touch on the pre-eviction notice, we have shown how that actually works here in Minnesota. There is a requirement in manufactured homes for pre-eviction notice. There's a requirement in certain types of subsidized housing. During the phase out of the eviction moratorium, there was a 15-day notice requirement. The sky did not fall during that period. In Minneapolis and St. Louis Park have passed 7 and 14-day required notices. Again, the sky hasn't fallen in those cities. Rather, we've actually seen practitioners that are at housing court, like legal aid folks, have shown and seen the benefits of those tenants getting notification about rental assistance, rent help amend before an eviction is filed. It's just common sense. So I didn't really speak too much to the politics of it, but again, a lot of the provisions that HOME LIne has pushed are really common sense items that impact our clients throughout the state on a regular basis. We are answering questions about these types of things on a daily basis.
And Libby, I do need to jump off in just a second, but can I just say a couple of words to everybody before I jump off? I just want to say that all of your work is paying off. Everybody who fights to give greater access to housing for, housing stability, for all of the ways in which housing is negatively impacted and what we need to do to change, to have so that people have access to affordable housing, all the different things you all are doing is making a difference. We are very well aware that, a tiny percent, and you all are aware of the tiny percent, right? Less than 1% of the Minnesota's state budget goes to housing. Everybody is aware of that. Everybody understands the importance of this. And it's because of all of your work and all of the pushing of all the advocates and those who have been fighting for this, that the visibility on this issue has been elevated to where it is. And I want you all to keep fighting that, even though sometimes it doesn't look like legislation is passing, we are moving the needle on this issue. And so I just want to encourage everyone to keep doing this work, to keep fighting for it, because eventually we're going to get it across the finish line. And I just want to share really quick that, Chair Hausman has been such an amazing champion. And that what she did was she actually met with our caucus across the state. And last night, Minneapolis and St. Paul met, and we all talked about what are the specific issues regionally that we want to address and how do we want to fix this and what are the bills we want to put forward. And Representative Hausman has already made the commitment to me that she would keep all of the tenant protection bills in her committee as well, because it is a top priority for her. So I just want you all to keep fighting the good fight, because it matters, and we will get this over the finish line. If it's not this year, I know that within the next few years, if we hold the majority, we will be able to continue to do great work and to really get people into stable and secure housing. So thank you all. I couldn't do this work without all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Her. That was a great way to motivate all of us as we enter into this session. So thank you so much. And just on that, I think we'll pivot to how everyone on this call can stay engaged and how we can continue to connect in this 2022 legislative session. So there's a few ways right now that I want to encourage you to take action. One is to endorse the agenda or the campaign. I put the link, and Elizabeth had linked it earlier. That's very simple, either as an individual or an organization. We demonstrate support to our allies and to those who are opposed, and the more we can grow that list of endorsers, the stronger we can come across to lawmakers. So I really encourage you to do that. This is on the Homes for All agenda, so endorsing the Homes for All agenda is another way that you can support this as well as some of those other tenant protection issues that Representative Her and Eric talked about. And then staying directly connected, I put my email here as well as Shayna's. And for staying connected with me, I encourage anybody who's interested in learning more, being more engaged, to directly reach out to me. As Representative Her said, we need to put pressure on lawmakers, continue to put pressure on our allies, not make assumptions that they're behind us, make them continue to hear from us, as well as to the current opponents. And so doing that through direct lobbying, direct advocacy, emails and phone calls, and I can help connect you with your lawmakers, help with script writing and things of that nature. So please email me if you're interested in taking a more active role in terms of advocacy and engagement this legislative session. And then, of course, you can always sign up for MHP's MHP Connect and follow MHP and Housing Justice Center on social media as well for ways to stay connected and engage this legislative session. And with that, I want to just wish everyone a great rest of your day and thank you for joining us this morning.